panel is gonna be in English. However...
Thank you.
Come on, you've been here for like 3 days. You speak the language.
Shalom.
During the Q&A, which we will have at the end, it's okay to ask questions in Hebrew, I will translate, but the rest of the panel is going to be in English, okay? So, we should start, right, if it's okay with you. My name is Karen, I'm a doctor, I'm a sci-fi writer, go to the Geffen, come to Meorot. Let's start with the panelists.
My name is Robert Friedman, I'm a science fiction writer, I'm an Israeli Canadian, I write in English, published by an American small publishing house, by Kevin J. Anderson, also a few dozen short stories.
I'm Brendan Sanderson, I write primarily... Alright, I won't explain anymore, you get it.
Hi, I am Mia Foreman. I'm a mother. I have spoke, you know. You can buy it at your house, and I have answer everything Karen wants us to ask.
Oh, I like your approach.
Karen is going to ask the questions.
My name is Ehud Maimon. I'm a short fiction editor. I edit Hayoye, the anthology that the Society publishes yearly. I write essays and reviews, and I also lecture at cons forever, I think, something like this.
Okay, and I'm Karen, and I'll be your host for the next hour and something. Okay, so this panel is about the memory of metal. I don't know if you've ever heard about Mistborn. It's this lovely trilogy. I'm enjoying myself way too much. Okay, so I think we should start talking about Mistborn, because a lot of people read it, right? Metals in Mistborn.
Yeah, so a lot of people ask this question, where did this come from? My entire writing career is based around my love of the intersection between science and superstition. And I love, my favorite era in history is probably the early 1900s, where science was starting to get applied to a lot of different things. Like I remember in school, I read this really great paper that in like 1910 someone had written, a scientist went to study the science of ditch digging so that he could help the ditch diggers dig better ditches. And there was really this sense that science could solve everything. And the way that science was starting to be applied, particularly everything up from the Renaissance to about the late industrial, the early modern era, that's really fascinating to me. I love, for instance, that Isaac Newton believed in alchemy, and he tried really hard to make it work, and tried science to make alchemy work. I love things like alchemy that are like this bridging gap, where it starts at something really kooky like spontaneous generation, which makes some little kernel of sense, and then people like say, well, maybe it's this, things can become other things, and then eventually the scientific method says, no, it just doesn't work. But that bridging area is really fascinating to me. And in my books, I'm often looking for something that evokes that same sort of feeling of the bridge between science and superstition. When I came to write Mistborn, the first version, the book, one that didn't get published, when I was designing the Magic System, the thing I was really looking for was something that had 1 foot in alchemy and 1 foot in science. And I was looking for a science that mixed really well with alchemy, and I ended up just on metabolizing, biological metabolism. And I thought, what if there were a fantastical fantasy way where you could metabolize something unusual? This is a very common trope dating back, what are magical potions? You metabolize magic and it does something to you. But adding actually that kind of biological component component was really fascinating to me. What I really also like is like the emergence of the periodic table, where people are trying to, you know, put different elements into different feelings and boxes and groupings. And so I started taking these metals and saying, all right, we have a fantastical version of a periodic table. Can I build a table out of these things where different groupings of metals do different things with the magic system? A lot of my magics are pretending that there's a new branch of science in the world that we're writing, and this branch of science will follow the scientific method, but people don't understand it completely yet. Just like, you know, things moved around on the periodic table as people figured out how actually to put things. I wanted metals moving around. I wanted it to be incompletist first. That's why there's only half the table in the first book. I wanted this idea that this is constantly evolving, that it is a science, that we're learning to place things in correct places and things like that. And the metals were chosen. I chose metals specifically because of the connection to alchemy. I thought it would have a nice resonance for people, and I think we'll talk about it later on the panel. Metal has this really cool intersection with history and with mythology and with, like, you can kind of watch the advances in metal and parallel military expansion and things like this, alongside who's figuring out how to make the better metals, who can make a steel that's stronger than other people's steel. There's just this nice resonance and fantasy between metals and the advance and progress of history. And so, designing this, I wanted each of the metals to then fit into groupings. And that's why we have a metal and its alloy, and why they kind of all fall in these batches and things like that. Where I designed the actual powers is a different place. People say, where did the different powers for Allomancy come from? If there are those who haven't read it, there are 16 different abilities, but 8 of them are kind of core. And what I did is I knew Mistborn was going to be a heist story about a gang of thieves who are each going to have a magical talent. If you don't know what a heist is usually a team of people who each have an ability that they bring together to try to pull off something incredible. Some of my favorite heist stories are Inception is a great heist story. I love Sneakers, if you haven't seen it, a good old classic heist. But even things like The Sting or The Italian Job or things like this, I love this group dynamic. And I wanted to create a group where every different person had a different magical talent that they then brought to the group. And so I designed the powers specifically to enhance the different roles in a classic thieving crew from a heist. And so your thieving crew from a heist usually has a fast talker, they usually have a planner, they have a fixer who can get stuff, they usually have a really strong person, they usually have a sneaky person. And I built different powers to enhance these different abilities.
It's basically the A-Team. The Fantastic A-Team.
But no chopper.
No choppers, but no, it's like
lots
that.
of metal on
Lots of metal, and Mr. T's wearing all sorts of metal, yeah.
The thing that I don't know, resonated with me that I liked when I read it was the properties of pushing and pulling, which are basically inherent in metals. We talk about it as magnetism in day-to-day life, but I think it was a very clever application of these attributes of metals that each of us know to the fantastic world.
Yeah, one of the things I try to do in magic systems that makes magic work really well is that there are just some underpinnings that are part of the real world that you can then extrapolate. Magnetism having an on and off what made it Allomancy really click with people. And because we metabolize things to get energy, you explain, oh, you eat metal and weird things happen, and people are like, huh? But as soon as you read it, it makes sense, it clicks, because this is just how we get our energy. And so that helped me design the idea of the poles, allowed me to design, all right, I'm going to do 4 metals for my base metals, and then 4 opposites. Pushing and pulling also kind of came from I love science. I don't love the math of science, but I love science. I know. I did pass calculus in college. It's part of what taught me that I shouldn't be a mathematician. I really like the idea of vector science being applied to something like a fantasy book. And one of the things I've learned, I come up with some rules for myself about designing magic. They're just things I've learned. Sanderson's second law, right, of magic is what I called it. This is when I figured out that really what your characters and your magic can't do tends to be more interesting than what it can. Right? Like the pushing and pulling, if you haven't read the books, you can drop a coin and you can push in your center of gravity. If the coin is against something heavy, you're thrown backward. But if you throw it up here and push it, you will push it away from you. And so equal and opposite, Newtonian force and things like this. It's really just a weaker version of flying, right? A character can just fly, wouldn't need any of this. But by limiting it, by making the powers more interesting and saying, they can't do this, you can only push or pull directly toward or away from you, your center of mass is going to be really important to all of this, then suddenly it becomes way more interesting to write about and more interesting to read about. A weaker magic than simply flying is more interesting because it forces the characters to use their limitations, to compensate for the limitations and use their abilities. And so the pushing and pulling, I found it really fun to write.
Yeah, but you didn't only use the metals to activate powers, you used them to store memory.
That's
like
right.
A computer chip or a sheet of
Yeah.
not paper, apparently.
Yeah. So Feruchemy was designed for a different book originally. This magic system, if any of you haven't read it, you can take certain attributes from yourself and store them in bits of metal and then draw it out later. So for instance, if you have a memory you want to keep pristine, you can stick it in a piece of metal and pull it out later. If you can spend time being half as strong for a while, you can be 1.5 times as strong later on, but you'll have to live through being weak and then drawing it out. And this actually came from the first origin of this magic system was when I was in high school. I am an insomniac, and high school was really rough for me because I'm not good at maintaining a normal sleep schedule. And I would be exhausted during the day, and then at night go to bed and wouldn't fall asleep, and I would lay in bed for hours. It was really good for me becoming a writer. I thought about a lot of different stories during this time, but I remember sitting in class being so exhausted, thinking how unfair it was that I went to bed on time, but I did not fall asleep for 4 hours, and just wishing I could take my sleepiness in school, store it up in some sort of archive, and then when it's time to go to bed, draw it out and just fall right asleep. And that was the origins of Feruchemy. When I brought it to the Mistborn books, I realized I needed something to tie it all together, and the metal, of course, was the natural format because tying the magics together through using a common sort of implement, a focus, metal for that, ended up working really well as a metaphor. And so I made you be able to stick different things in different pieces of metals, and since I already had 16 metals that I was building on, I just had you be able to stick to 16 different things in. It ended up working really well.
If it's okay to open it a bit and talk a bit more about fantasy and metals in fantasy, since we have a few writers on board, other writers. So we've seen uses of metal ever since, stories and fairy tales and until today, when you use it in high fantasy. If you want me to actually make a question, I will, but I know that you already thought of something to say. So I can't wait. Yeah, go.
Yeah, I just want to add about Mistborn that one of the things I liked about the trilogy
You
is
promised to answer my question.
I will.
You didn't ask a question.
the precise, the precise precision of the use of the metals. I mean, if it's not exactly the right amount of metal, so it won't work, or it will damage the people who use them, and not every metal works, sometimes there are surprises. If you take the wrong metal, something weird will happen. And I think it's really, I like it because it's really parallel to the actual world, because metal is something very, very important in our society since 1,000 years ago, since men discovered the iron and started to manipulate it and build things with it. And all this precision is very, very important in real life since then until today. I mean, if we're building an airplane, and we don't work on our metals right, the airplane will just break in the air and everybody will die. And like cars and like everything else, on our daily life, we don't appreciate the hard work of the people who work with it. So I think we can learn from fantasy a lot. I mean, all this sword fighting, and so someone built that sword. Like we mentioned Excalibur for King Arthur. I mean, it's a very, very special metal that made the sword, and we blessed it and did a lot of things to make it very, very special. But if they would work about it in the wrong way about the sword, it would just break on the first use, and we won't have any story.
In a lot of fantasy books, the central point is actually not about the magical power of the metal itself, but about characterization, about characters, how they are involved in creating the metals. In many cases, the characters have the special power, and that's what makes the metal special. Again, Tolkien, the dwarves, they have a very highly skill on creating very powerful, strong metals. Toph from Avatar, if you saw that Chinese girl. So in the battle she had with the Fire Nation, she didn't have, the stone themselves didn't have any power, but she was able to manipulate it, then using her feet, and I think they sank the other ships. If anyone saw the Wonder Woman movie? The RS, the metal he was using, he used like sheet from steel that was taken from tanks and trucks, and he was able to craft an iron armor and sword and fight Wonder Woman. So the power was not really the metal, the power is the character. The character is what made the metal so powerful.
I think there's a lot of myth kind of back in our collective unconscious about people, I think a lot of Valyrian steel or dwarven metal or mithril or things like this kind of come from a real place in our lore and history where there were certain peoples who were creating better steels or steel in the first place, which could break other weapons, which could survive other weapons. And I think fantasy reaches toward those ideas that we pretend that the technological race happened in our modern era, but it's been happening way back since the Stone Age. Different groups of humans and Neanderthals even and things have been competing over a thousands of year-long technological race to who can make the best weapons. And that's deeply rooted in kind of, I think, our history and our mythology, this idea of swords that can't be broken, or metals that are stronger than other metals. And it comes even up to the early modern era. Napoleon famously had a set of gold plates that if you got to eat on the gold plates, you were special, but there was a better set of plates that if you were really special, he fed you on. You know what they were? Aluminum. Not platinum, not something. They were aluminum, the star metal, which was really, really rare until we invented electrolysis and certain electrical methods of making aluminum. Until then, this metal that fell from the sky was so rare that it was mythological almost.
I think there's, if you talk about metals in fantasy, in high fantasy in particular, I think it's kind of hard to even imagine it without metals because it's so essential. You've got the iron, the bronze, the steel, if you need the armor and the arms. You've got the silver and gold for the money, and then you've got quicksilver and other metals which are magic metals. And this is something that you took and expanded on in your books, which are going beyond the classical fantasy.
I have to say, the funny thing is that when you think about something that is based on metal, I think about science fiction, because you can't build a spacecraft out of plastic, I think. Right? I have one or two space. Why don't you use more plastic in your high fantasy?
If you are, can I ask a question? Because it's been fascinating.
If you're asking, I'm going to answer.
Well, since it's about future books that he might write, that might write, you took Mistborn to the 1900s. Can you take it to, let's say, the 21st century and go plastic?
Yeah, well, I actually, when I pitched Mistborn to my editor in 2004, Moshe, who was supposed to be here at the con, but he ditched us. He wasn't feeling well, it's okay. When I called Moshe and I pitched Mistborn to him, I pitched it as 3 trilogies. I pitched it as past, present, future. I wanted to do a fantasy story and then an urban fantasy 1980s level technology story where the myths and legends of what the characters in the fantasy book became the foundation of religion and culture in this. And I wanted to do a science fiction series where the magic turned into the means by which space travel is possible. And I got through this big pitch to him and he said, and I still remember the exact phrase he used, he said, "Wow, you're ambitious." And I said, "You have no idea." The 1900s was kind of a stopgap because I realized I missed the world and wanted to do something in between. And the Wax and Wayne books grew out of my not wanting to be separated from Mistborn as long as it was going to take to get to Era 2 at that point, now Era 3. I still intend to do it. But plastics are going to be really fun for the Mistborn world because, you know, things you can't push or pull on, but, you know, right now people can build kind of guns out of plastic, right, and things like this. They're a real thing that exists, and their technology, that's an area they're probably going to be very much put more research into and things like this because stuff that can kill you that can't interact with allomancy is really valuable.
I have to say, as a doctor, I really appreciate it if people would start in your books eating plastic instead of metal, which is toxic and you shouldn't eat it.
I think you can have gold, right? Gold's inert and will not react, but most of the others you should not be eating.
Yeah, don't eat metal.
Yeah, don't eat metal.
If you eat silver, you'll become blue. The skin, no.
Yes, yes. Don't eat aluminum. Okay, we can stop with the not eating list and go back to high fantasy.
But Karen, you remember they burn it and they don't leave it in the body for the night. So.
Then you have Marvel.
I heard a spoiler that there's a metal that if you eat you become Mistborn, and it sounds like you're encouraging young people to eat things they don't know what they that they found in a dark cave with a ghost telling them to touch it.
You know, fantasy is you shouldn't also accept what is that quote from Monty Python? Swords thrown from pawns for determining your not a means of
Strange lady finding pawns is not a basis for a system of government.
Yeah, so let's just let's also admit that if you have a mugger coming against you, you shouldn't pull out your wand and start saying fake Latin phrases and hope it works. Fantasy you can extrapolate too far to take too literally, but of course it's the metaphor of fantasy that we love. One of the reasons that I love fantastical metals is because metal is such a part of our lives, and it transforms our lives, and plastics also. But metals, it's really interesting to me just how our history as a species, it parallels our development and ability to use metals, like the space age and the development of aluminum is a really big deal to how we were able to achieve what we did, but we couldn't do that without electricity, and it's really fascinating to me.
We veered into eating metals in history, which is my background is in history, and there's a theory that one of the reasons for the fall of the Roman Empire was that they used lead, and there was massive lead poisoning basically because they used lead in cooking and in their plumbing. The word plumbing in English comes from plumbum, which is lead in Latin.
Yeah, I intentionally didn't use lead or mercury in my magic systems because...
I wondered why they were missing from
I intentionally didn't because I knew that it would kick people out, right? That's another thing, like when you say people are eating lead, right, in your book. Even in a fantasy book, it's going to make some snickers. People are going to stop and be like, wait a minute, this is a bad idea. And as my popularity's grown, I've become more and more aware of how many times I'm going to have to answer the same question. If I put it in my book, I'm so glad I didn't use lead, because in every signing I would be answering 50 or 60 times. You do know that lead's a bad idea to eat, right? I still remember when we used to paint little minis, they used to be lead. And then eventually the whole community changed to pewter and they got more expensive. I was really annoyed, but it's probably a good idea.
Other than...
No, I just wanted to add, we all remember what happened in Flint City with the lead pipes. The people got real lead poisoning. I mean, this is something that happens in the real world, and it did happen in the past. And it might happen
right
in
now,
the future.
the water is still...
Yeah, they can't fix it, and people are still drinking those lead water, and really crisis. And we should thank for living in a country that have really good water pipes
and
without lead.
And universal health care. Okay, going back to metals and high fantasy, other than eating them and being able to manipulate stuff, you never did, and I don't remember seeing radioactive metals in books.
Yeah, I think that this is just for the same reason that we don't want to, like things that kick people out of books, even though it would be a little bit realistic, because up until the early modern era, or even the modern era, people were using radioactive materials and be like, this is just cool. They didn't know it was killing them, which is horrifying but also very realistic. But putting that sort of thing in a book is a bit like, there's a phrase I learned in college. I don't know if this will translate well to you guys, but one of my friends said, you want to avoid gorillas in phone booths. So this phrase is when you have your character walking along, having an argument with like his girlfriend, right? And he's arguing on the phone with his girlfriend, and you're describing, and you're getting the reader really invested in this. And then you mention, and he passed a gorilla in the phone booth, and then goes back to the argument with his girlfriend. Every reader has just left and not cared about the argument between, the relationship, and are like, wait. There was a what in the what, right? There's a gorilla in the phone booth. Tell me about the gorilla in the phone booth. And even though the relationship's probably more interesting, there are certain things that just catch our attention that you can't let go of as a reader until it's been addressed. And there are certain things like using mercury. If mercury shows up in a book, then the reader's mind just starts saying, this is really dangerous, this is really bad, and until you find a way to address it in the text, it's going to help make it harder for the reader to pay attention to your action story. And radioactive materials are like that. You can certainly use them well, but it's going to be like a girl in the phone booth. Until you describe and explain and get those consequences done, the reader's going to have trouble.
I can think of one fantasy book that has a reference to radioactive metals in it, which is, I think it's Paul Anderson's, it's by Paul Anderson. It's called Three Swords and Three Lions. And it's about an engineer in the Second World War that find himself transported into a fantastical world. And it comes to the realization that the reason dragon's gold is gonna kill you is because when the dragon, there's something about when the dragon is slain, some of his body turns into radioactive isotopes, and if you take the gold with you, it's radioactive and it's gonna kill you.
That sounds like Paul Anderson, and that also sounds pretty awesome.
Okay. So what other uses can you think of for metal in high fantasy, other than making the best armor, the best sword, or eating them?
So one of the great high fantasy interfaces with metal is the culture that doesn't have metal and uses a different. So I'm thinking of Rayfei's Rift War, or I'm thinking of Dragonlance, which did have metal, but metal was in a different proportion. You can play with these ideas. If you guys haven't read in Rift War, there's like one side of the war that doesn't have access to metal in the same way that the other side does, but they have different fantastical materials, which allows the battle to be really interesting, the war between these two sides. Or in something like Dragonlance, where iron is just way more rare, so an iron piece is worth more than it would be in our world, and kind of just indicating to the reader, hey, metal is a really valuable thing here. And playing with those sorts of things is very hard, because iron is really one of the most common elements in the galaxy, and so you kind of have to, you know, you have to play with that idea a little bit, but you can do it, and you can say, hey, they don't have access to this common thing. How does society progress if you don't have access to, if you can't make the leap to the Iron Age or the Steel Age?
Another thing metal used in fantasy is for trade. Gold or silver and other materials. That's what actually enable commerce all around the world.
Yeah, or different values of it. One of the most fascinating things in our world is how in the New World they didn't develop coinage in the same way, and so metals, so gold, was of a different value to some of the Mesoamerican cultures, because they didn't have coinage, they didn't want it. It was still good for jewelry and things like that, so it still had value, but it wasn't valued in the same way. And so then you have two different groups, one who values something a great deal and the other who kind of doesn't, meeting together, and how poorly it went for the Mesoamericans because of another metal, steel, and things like that. And it raises lots of interesting and unfortunate and sad parts of our history, but which can be fertile ground for storytelling.
Well, I think besides of all this, I think really nice thing that we can do with metals in fantasy is using the knowledge of the readers, that the characters in this fantasy, usually some medieval-like world or some other world with low technology, they don't know. For instance, everybody here in our world, in the technological world, knows that electricity goes really good in metals. Okay, most metals you can get electrified if you touch a metal that is in the touching some wires, or if there's a light from the sky and you're holding a metal and raising your hand, you probably get electrified by the light. But the characters don't know this. I mean, you can write really scary scenarios just because the characters don't know about those dangers that you as readers know. So it's really a good tool. And since metals are so flexible and you can make a lot of things from them, not like stones or other materials that are not so flexible and you cannot manipulate them with fire and all this other technological way, it just you can do it a lot with it. Just by using the knowledge of the readers that the characters don't have, because they live in this ancient world.
I'm going to do the editor thing for a second and tell you what you shouldn't do with metal in high fantasy. Don't use vibranium. This is the ultimate deus ex machina. Don't use a metal that for some reason gives everybody high IQ, and for some reason they're so rich but they're not trading it actually with anybody, and it's a wonderful onion, okay? It's a metal that for some reason does everything and it's not explained, and it's just not convincing. Do what they said.
Yeah, make your research.
Yeah, and don't copy from the X-Men.
That's adamantium. Just Marvel, Warblerian is adamantium, not vibranium. Right, guys? Am I right on this? That's okay.
Unlike vibranium, which actually has just one specific quality. It doesn't do everything.
Yeah, you should be sorry.
It's worked for a while now.
Okay.
No, but Edium really does have one specific thing that it does. It has this internal logic. The thing that Ehud was talking about just with Vibranium is just everything. You can do two surprise with it, and you can build a spaceship, and you can bend it or not bend it. You can stop bullets, but it can do other stuff like.
Well, you know, different fantasy elements do different things in your story, and that's a good thing to take to heart. Knowing the type of story you want to tell, knowing the effect you want to have on the reader, and these sorts of things can be very handy. I do like some magic systems that are very not defined, that are not so explicit. I often use Lord of the Rings as a fantastic example of this, because Lord of the Rings has, again, a metal, the One Ring. And the One Ring is what we call a hard magic system, right? One Ring is hard. You put on the One Ring, you turn invisible, but you get corrupted faster, and the Eye of Sauron can see you, right? It has a distinct benefit and distinct consequences. And, you know, carrying it corrupts you even by itself. And also, you know, it has these other things. You might be able to control the other rings, but its use in the story, very hard magic system. But at the same time, Tolkien uses a very soft magic system in the form of what Gandalf can do. What can Gandalf do?
He can, I know,
Yeah.
he can turn white.
He can turn white.
You can't say spoiler.
Yeah, you can't say spoiler on Tolkien. But Gandalf works. I don't think Gandalf doesn't work, because Gandalf's purpose in the story is to raise the sense of mystery and wonder. When Gandalf does something, it reminds you, the whole point of Gandalf in a lot of things is to remind you how small, pun intended, the hobbits are, right? The hobbits are very small in this world of giants. And there are these powerful wizards who can do things they don't even understand. And the whole point of Gandalf is to say, there's a much larger world. You're part of something much bigger. But your little piece is take this ring that does this specific thing to this specific location. And Tolkien manages to balance both a hard and a soft magic system brilliantly. And it's a real masterclass in how to use the different types of magic. The one that can do anything, but is rarely used and often isn't used by our central protagonists, but enhances the sense of wonder and mystery, and the very clear magic that has specific abilities that you use at consequences in order to increase tension for your characters, both used wonderfully in those books.
I'm thinking about the characters of the metal of other than the One Ring, you have the Elric, right? Elric sword that can ingest your soul.
Yeah. Oh, I love Stormbringer. Stormbringer is an amazing sword. If you guys haven't read Elric, it was the inspiration for Nightblood. Was the Elric cycle with Stormbringer? Is this sword that sucks people's souls and gives the main character the ability to be strong because he was born very weak, but it usually harvests the souls of the people he loves most. As he's trying to save the world, and it's this give and take. Do I use this powerful sword because I'm really saving the world? It's really important, but it's probably going to suck the souls of everyone I love. Creates some really great tension, but those books are kicks to the face. They are not pleasant stories necessarily.
He does very well the thing that you talked about. What is the price of magic? What is the price that you pay for using it? And I think in a very real way, the Stormbringer is a metaphor for weapons as a whole. Yeah. What is the cost of using weapons?
You know, we can talk about this though too, because this is really interesting in its use of metal. Is the advent of warfare that doesn't depend as much on training is another sort of metaphor you see in fantasy books, because for a long time, having a suit of armor, even having a sword, really expensive. Knowing how to use that sword, really kind of expensive. You have to spend a lot of time training. You have to have, either you have to be a professional soldier, or you have to be, a lord who can have all the support staff. And then the advent of gunpowder and weapons that you point, and this highly trained, very rich person who has spent their whole life learning to swing this death stick is shot dead by someone who just picked up a weapon for the first time. And that was the first time in history that could really happen, because a bow took tons of skill, but pointing a gun and pulling the trigger doesn't. Now, obviously, aiming at things is very important, but you see a lot in fantasy, but once, you know, they had a whole line of these, it didn't matter if you could aim. It didn't matter, you didn't have to pull back a bow, you just pulled the trigger and people died. You see a lot in fantasy of this changeover. The end of the era of steel and the start of the era of gunpowder is a really big turning point in fantasy books. If you guys haven't read the Powder Mage books by Brian McClellan, I recommend those. Brian's a great writer, and I'm not just saying that because he was one of my students. About a story where there's a fantastical version of this, that new gunpowder-based magic has come around, and the old traditional elemental magic systems are all threatened by the fact that the newfangled powder mages, it's just a metaphor for the fact that knights were suddenly able to be killed by people who could pull the trigger, but he does a really good job with it, so that's a fun series, if you like that sort of idea.
So as someone whose grandfather fought on horses with the Polish army against the armed German armies, they lost, by the way.
Was that World War I?
Actually, my grandfather fought in both World Wars, but...
Because that was a real eye-opener. If you guys didn't know about this, in World War I in particular, they were still having cavalries charge machine gun embankments. It was crazy.
Because they thought no one could beat a person on a horse. But since you took us to real history, which is like we already coordinated the stuff of the panel before, I'm going to take some to the historian here, who already mentioned the Romans drinking lead, which is again not recommended.
So there's, if you look at the way we break down history to ages, history and prehistory, we use the advancement in manipulating metals, because after the Stone Age and the Neolithic and Chalcolithic eras, we get the Copper Age. That's when we started learning how to extract copper and use it. And then comes the Bronze Age. And this is when we found out that if we actually combine lead and create an amalgam, we get not lead, copper. Sorry, you drop tin into copper. You get a metal which is much harder, much sharper, and keeps its sharpness for a long time. And this was great, and this was a wonderful advantage to anybody who could do this until we got iron, which is even better at it. And we had iron for a long, long time.
But our iron is harder to use, right? Iron and steel both, than bronze, because bronze you can just cast and then sharpen and it works. But you got to forge if you're making stuff.
You got to heat it up to higher temperatures. You got to forge it. You got to impurities impact it differently. If you come across, if you start talking about iron and lead and iron and steel, and you get steel, you get high carbon steel, low carbon steel, and which is better for what weapon? And this dominated our society and our history for a very long time. And Brandon's mentioned it before. Who can make the better steel? Do you know what the Dam Busters raid is? Have you ever heard about it? Raise your hand if you did. Okay, not many people. In 1944, a group of airplanes launched from Britain. Their mission was a full moon night, which was very risky. They flew to a couple of dams all over Germany and dived on those dams, getting shot at all the time. The whole mission, and they lost something like 40% of the airplanes, if I remember correctly. The whole idea was to bust those dams and let out the water because the German way of making steel took something like 8 liters of water for every kilo of steel made. That was a staggering loss of life just to make sure the Germans can't make steel. This is how important this is how important metals were to us until very soon. They still are, but we are learning to go beyond metals now.
I want to add something. I mean, we are talking about fantasy and high fantasy and all these fantasies that we have. As we said, it's like in some medieval world, because then metal was the best thing we had. But all these metals, plus new materials that we discovered, actually made this time, our time, the time we are living in some sort of fantasy. Fantasy as maybe people imagine it. Just think, every one of us has this magic thing in his pocket, okay? It can show pictures, and we can communicate with people, we can communicate from multiple talks. Like, I mean, I have this WhatsApp group of my friends. We have 12, 14 people in the group, and we're just talking, and we can go to Facebook, and we have forums, and we talk with everybody in the world. Just think, maybe the older ones, they remember 30 years ago, so there were people that loved, to communicate on radio. They had this hobby, so they were that. They had this radio transmitter at home, and they were talking with people from other countries. I mean, I remember they showed someone in Israel talking with a friend in Iran over the radio, and it was so exciting. And now everyone can do this like this from this little machine that everybody has in his pocket, and is getting mad because the battery is still so low. But I mean. Because of the battery, and just remember, without all those steel and plastic and all those other things that we are making and extracting from earth, and I mean, this is magic. I mean, just think about all this things we have in our fantasy books for magic. We have it right here, and it's just getting better every year. So we live in fantasy.
This is for YK calling CQ. I still remember the call sign of the ham radio station that we had in my kibbutz when we grew up. For Z for YK, for Zulu for Yankee Cobra.
I love what you said, because now lets me end with last question, and I would love it if you all answer it. I don't think you're describing fantasy. I think you're describing science fiction. It's true that we don't have flying cars or portals. But we have telecommunication, we have medical screening devices. I mean, I know they're not handheld, but they're very close to it. I happen to know that we've already privatized the moon, So I think my question is, since urban fantasy is taking a huge part of fantasy, we're losing, less people with wands and more people, magically directing their bullets. Is there really a difference between sorry, I want to say differently. How much science is affecting fantasy today? And that would be the last question. So if you don't answer, we're all just going to go to the audience.
First thing that popped into my mind is Harry Potter series. Like on the newspaper that we see moving picture in it, we have it in real life. So I think the difference between magic and technology, I'm not going to use it to outside technology, it's getting smaller and smaller. And I don't remember who said it, but I read somebody quoting that modern technology is magic to people who are not familiar with that.
Arthur C. Clarke.
I still break the laws of thermodynamics right and left, which is science fiction.
We're not going to tell anyone.
Yeah. This is why some people have complained that sci-fi and fantasy are conflated in bookstores and things, and I've never been one of those, because I think they're, two sides of the same coin. where we're trying to explain the world through kind of extreme storytelling in a lot of ways, and we'll use whatever tool is appropriate for that. And a lot of sci-fi fantasy blur the lines intentionally. A lot of science fiction borrows from fantasy, and a lot of fantasy borrows from science fiction. And I think that while you can certainly find certain things far on either side of the line, the middle is a big blurry mess, and that's a good thing because we're just all learning as writers to use the tools that best tell the story we want to tell.
So you can add science to your fiction.
Yeah.
Hey.
Yeah, if I can talk about my books, I mean, there's a boy from our world goes to this fantasy world, and he does use knowledge from our world when he needs to solve problems and figure out what's going on. And he does succeed in defining the sickness that he sees. Everybody thinks it's just some random sickness, some mystical sickness, and he said, okay, those people, they have the problem, and I know what's the problem is, what's the cause of the problem, so I know how to solve it. And he does it because he learned at school, and he learned from his uncle doctor a few facts that he can, observe and see. And the people that live there, they don't know all those things. They didn't learn it. They didn't discover them yet. And they have magic in this fantasy world, and it's actually holding them back because since they can have magic solutions to things, they don't investigate further. They just, get the priest or the magician to solve the problems. So science is very important, and I think even in fantasy world, and use it. If you're writing a fantasy world, don't forget science, and scientific character is great.
Yeah, we are seeing the blurring of the lines, and it's very good. We see it in medical systems which are regularly built, like Brandon Sanderson does in his book. We see it in books like All the Birds in the Sky by Charlie J. Anders, which combines science fiction and fantasy, or science and fantasy. We see it. I still haven't made up my mind about N.K. Jemisin's Broken Arrows Trinity. Is it fantasy, or is it the science of using, those powers, those forces? And I think it is good. It only enriches the worlds that are created in the genre lately. I'm all for it.
Yeah, I'm all for science, as you know me. Okay, so first of all, thank you to our panelists. I'm going to say that the books that we've mentioned that are translated to Hebrew, as far as I know, are Cherev HaSheol and של מייקל מורקוק, לא התבלבלתי, ופורצי הסכרים, לא התבלבלתי גם, פורצי הסכרים גם תורגם לעברית.
וגם 3 לבבות ו3 אריות של אנדרסון, די קשה להשיג אותו, הוא תורגם שם בשנות ה-80 לדעתי.
3 לבבות ו3 אריות הוא מהסדרה הלבנה. הספרים של יעל, כמובן, והספרים של ברנדון נמצאים בדוכן של יואב בחוץ. Sorry for the Hebrew, I know you're following everything. We will take questions from the audience now. Wait. I would like to quote my dear friend who isn't here, Didi. A question is a short sentence with a question mark at the end. If you have any remarks you want to make, email it. Wait. Also, אם קשה לכם להתבטא באנגלית, זה לגמרי מקובל, תשאלו בעברית, אני אתרגם, אני מבטיחה לשמור כמה שיותר קרוב לשאלה המקורית שלכם. אם טעיתי, תתקנו אותי. Now we will take questions. Wow. That sign, no. That sign didn't say come to Meorot, so you failed. סליחה. הדס.
Magic system in Mistborn that also involves a lot of metal, and I want to ask if
question was about Mistborn and
Wheel of Time.
Wheel of Time, right? And whether writing about metal and writing about smithing influenced each other, right?
So Mistborn was done before I worked on the Wheel of Time, but I began reading the Wheel of Time when I was 14 or 15, whatever that was. It was 1990, so I would have been just turning 15. Perrin being a smith, Perrin was my favorite character in the series when I was reading it as a kid. It's still, my favorite character. And so Perrin being a blacksmith was a big influence on my view of metals, and I could absolutely say that Allomancy was influenced by my love of reading about a character who was a blacksmith, and his relationship with the metal that he formed was really interesting to me.
Wow.
Not related, but I gotta ask, what about the arithmetist? What about it?
So the question is, what about the arithmetist? All right. Arithmetist is not metal-based, it's a chalk-based magic instead. So the arithmetist is so far the biggest and the most unfortunate casualty of me accepting doing the Wheel of Time. I was writing the arithmetist in 2007, and as book I had most recently finished when Harriet called me and asked me if I would finish the Wheel of Time. And I said yes, knowing it would derail my career completely, right? And this was one of the costs. I put off publishing the arithmetist for years. I gave it to Tor, but said we can't do this because I don't know when I would be able to do a sequel. And instead of doing the smart thing, which would have been to change the ending to not promise a sequel, I just told them to hold off until they just couldn't do it anymore because they loved the book so much. They told me they just really wanted to release it. And I was so busy with Wheel of Time and with Stormlight at that point, I said, go ahead, I know you really like the book, go ahead and release it. I really like the book too, but it came out without me really having a plan for when I would finish it. And that's been tough. I did try to find time to work on a sequel, and then the sequel just didn't work. I had been too far gone from the series to write the sequel at that point. I still think that I'll do it eventually. I finished up Legion, which was one of the other things I had done before, and I finished up Alcatraz 6 is written. I'm just finding the right time to release it. So that one is done. Bastille did write it instead of Alcatraz. And so those are two other series I kind of had going before. Arithmetist has been that big casualty. I will finish it someday, but I can't promise you when, because my whole career has taken a very different trajectory because of the Wheel of Time.
No. There's a Q&A tomorrow, I think, right? You can still have tickets, or, I don't know, kill someone to get tickets. Cape, blue cape. Are you gonna try and use superconductors or different alloys in your book?
Yeah, you'll see a lot of interaction with metal. In fact, Book 4 of Stormlight talks a little bit more about how metals and fabrials work. And if you watch very closely, you'll see parallels between that and what's happening in the Mistborn series. The further we get along, the more important things like superconductors and things will be. And kind of we'll start explaining why metals work the way they do in the Cosmere and stuff like that. So that's all stuff you can look forward to. So.
Yeah, you wave it, blue shirt, yeah.
Okay. What was the biggest challenge you encountered while incorporating metals into a world that has to work as a whole with systems of government and money and things like that?
I really love this question. I wish I have thought about it myself. What is the biggest challenge you encountered when introducing metals into a world that has to do so much with so many complicated systems, including governments and politics and stuff?
So this is not usually a bug, not a problem. This is a feature, right? One of my favorite books of all time is Dune, and one of the reasons I love Dune so much is it incorporates its magic into the economy, and into the cultures, and into the religions. And when these things in our world are interconnected, right? When you talk about the history of the advances in the ages of history, being able to have new metals that then you could form professional armies, that could lead to creating city-states which became nations, and this is all interconnected, and then religion is all tied into this and the spread of religion, and so it's actually really fun and interesting to me. It's not really a challenge, it is part of what I love about it. Though in Stormlight I had a slightly different problem in that on a world where mining was not going to be as big of a deal, how do I make them have metals and use metals when getting access to metal in the same way is going to be difficult for them? And there are some mining operations on Roshar, but I had to find different means by which they got a hold of metal, which is where soul casting came from.
I just have to say that the minute you said Dune, Ehud's eyes went all, ah, you're now his favorite person for the next few minutes. Ehud Zaluna, בלי משהו.
Is the reason aluminium is so distinct to the Cosmere have to do with what I talked about earlier? Yes, it's because aluminium, I love how it had this sort of mythological attachment in our own world, and I like that mythology. But the other cool thing that aluminum or aluminium does is it is a really powerful, strong, wonderful metal that in our society now is so common. You can, make cans out of it and sell it super cheap. But only 200 years ago was more valuable than gold. And that changeover let me build into the Mistborn system something that would then add a counter to the powers I was developing, which were going to become more and more common as we reach the modern era, that there would be a counter to them, which would also become more and more common. It was a really nice parallel that I could build into the system.
Aluminum is the most common element on the face of the earth, right? No.
Iron is.
Sorry.
Unless you count hydrogen, right? Isn't hydrogen? But the most common of the yeah.
Yeah, you're right. Right shirt over there.
So how are we going to deal with the fact that allomancy is genetic, and as it spreads to the population, the general power of it decreases in a given individual? What are we going to do in eras 3 and 4? And that is what we call a RAFO. Read and find out. You can find in Era 2 one group's attempts at dealing with that, but they are approaching it in a very scary way.
I have to ask, is it X-linked? Is it dominant? Is it...
So this actually plays into the way the Cosmere works, and so it is every person in the Cosmere has what I call a spiritual DNA, which exists. It goes back to Platonic forms. It's very weird, but it is not their actual genetic code. It is their spiritual genetic code, which works a little differently. So.
I'm biting my tongue right now. Richard. Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier that the Mistborn magic system is basically a periodic table of metals. There's T metals, A basic, A etc. But how would that affect the study of science and chemistry and the creating of the whole periodic table?
Well, how would the fact that they have a periodic table before the periodic table affect that? If you can see what's happening on Scadrial with the, even in Era 2, they have a disproportionate amount of understanding and study of metallurgy, and they are not nearly as good at other things. And so it has affected where they spend their focus and their research. Like, they don't have the radio when they kind of should. They had to get it from some other places. The idea of that technology and things like that. And so really what's happening there is I'm trying to keep it close, because Scadrial is an Earth analog, but at the same time show what they're stronger at and what they're weaker at. It has influenced the way they approach science in some interesting ways. We won't find out a lot more until Era 3, where one of the characters is more interested in the science, because the characters in Era 2 are mostly interested in shooting people and finding, you know, and perhaps creating interesting mixed drinks, but, you know, yeah. And finding lost
Puppies.
no, finding lost coins. Steris, yes.
No puppies. אוקיי, זה בלונדין. כן, אני מנחשת שזו פאה, אני מתנצל.
Do you know about people who ate metal because of this?
Do I know about people who eat metals because of Mistborn? People joke to me that they do, and I tell them, please don't. I get way more comments about people dreaming they were Mistborn, which happens apparently frequently. Do not eat the metals.
Yes, I'm very happy to hear that. I don't.
Could you make a magic system where you cannot study it with science, if it clashes with science, and should you do that? And would metals become scarce when allergy burns it?
So the question is, could you make a magic system that doesn't come from science, and should you? I think this is a good question for everybody.
Yeah, I was gonna go ahead and answer everyone. Yeah, one star. Could you make a magic system that clashes with science?
Yes, of course. I mean, when you write fantasy, basically, I mean, the first thing is that you can do everything, but you need to set your own rules, okay? And then you should stick with those rules that you set. But if those rules contradict science, it's okay. It doesn't need to contradict the science the same way all over the book. Just don't do whatever you like, because then you have nonsense and not a book. So yeah, you can decide that in your fantasy world, metals that are getting hot doesn't expand, but reduce their size. I actually had a teacher that taught me that at school, and the opposite. And I was this little naive girl, and it was like a year or two. I was thought she was right. Till I got to another teacher that explained the opposite, and everything made sense suddenly. So, I mean, just this, if you're going to stick with some unscience law, just stick with it, okay? As long as you stick with the same thing that you set up, it's okay. If you start jumping, it won't.
לא התכוונתי שזה מתנגש עם המדע שלנו, התכוונתי שאי אפשר לחקור אותו באמצעים מדעיים.
That you can't investigate magic in scientific. Sounds like at the beginning of Tarek Project book.
Yeah, no, there are Project books like that. Absolutely.
Yeah, actually, it's kind of the same, because magic is supernatural. If it's not natural, you can't investigate it with natural tools.
Yeah. כן, מנפנפים מאחור. כן, כן.
You have a very unique way that you create your character arcs. Usually it ends with a very specific scene with some very powerful sentence. So my question is, how do you build this arc, and how do you make it so powerful?
So how do I build character arcs the way that I do, which often ends with a character saying a very powerful sentence? That's the Stormlight way. But these are representing the way, kind of part of my philosophy on storytelling is that I like, personally, movies and books that overlap the plot with the character's journey, so the two are inseparable, the two aren't separate. And my favorite sort of movies and books are things where the character's understanding, the character coming to become someone else, the character changing and going through their arc, is the thing that lets them do what they need to do at the end of the story to make the plot come together. And I just managed to codify it in the Stormlight books, so that the reader could be in on the joke, so to speak, or not in the joke, but in on the idea that there are specific oaths that people are needing to take, and the things holding them back from taking those oaths are indications of what their character arc and journey is, so that when that oath is spoken, you know, it all comes together, and it's just what I love to do. It's what I love in other storytelling. So if you want to do this yourself, my recommendation is make sure that your character's arc is intimately tied to the things that are holding them back in the plot as well. You don't make those two things, you don't make the plot external to the character, you make it very personal to the character, so the journey thereon ties very tightly to the emotional journey they're on.
לא, איתם להשם, כן, שורה ראשונה.
So I started to put more of an emphasis on identity, which is a Cosmere concept that I don't talk a lot about before. Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm doing. He asked, I've started to put more identity, focus on identity in the books. Why did I do that? And so the answer is, why did I put more focus on identity in the books? These are things that are going to need to make sense to the reader by the time that we get to Era 3 and 4. And so I'm using Era 2 as a kind of ease you into this idea. And that identity as a Cosmere concept is very much tied to kind of the way the magics work behind the scenes. And so when you read Era 1, when you read Stormlight, the first 5 book arc, when you read Elantris, you read those books, you're looking at kind of just the effects of the magic. But the underlying principles are more on being shown in Warbreaker and in Era 2, where I'm starting to try to get you to understand the fundamental principles that make the magic systems work. So when we get to Era 3 and we start to need that understanding to really extrapolate how the magic's working, you'll be there on the same page with me, is my hope. So that's why. Can there be an Allomancer who's allergic to the metal? Yes. I have a lot of allergies myself, so I sympathize with you. We went and did one of those prick tests on me, because my wife's like, you sure seem to be allergic. And I'm like, yeah, I'm allergic to everything. And she's like, well, let's go find out what the things you're actually allergic to are. It was everything. Mildly allergic to everything that they skin pricked me on. And so, yes, I'm allergic to existing. And so it's like being a lefty high lady who is left-handed, or being an Allomancer who is allergic to your metal. These are really painful things that the culture and society and magic system is not built well to deal with. That highlight certain problems that people do have, and it totally can happen, and it sucks. Yeah, being allergic to your metal would totally suck. My dad is allergic to penicillin. Yep, and he got spinal meningitis at one point, and they realized that they could only kill it with the penicillin, so they injected him with just enough penicillin to not kill him, hoping it would cure the meningitis. They got it right. The penicillin did almost kill him, though.
Yeah, we have a protocol for that. Yeah. רוצה סגולה מצד שמאל באמצע? איפה אתה רוצה?
אתה, תרים את היד? כן.
There ever been just like in general some scientific concept that you want to add to your book because hey, it could be fun to add this, and then you research and it just changes everything you plan?
Yes. The question is, have you ever, to the entire panel, have you ever came across this cool idea, started researching, and then you changed everything you wanted to put in your book? Short answer is yes. Will you give examples now?
I don't write, I edit. I just say, this doesn't work, change it.
I had one of these to give the other panelists time to think about it. So I had a really great idea. And this great idea for a magic system was a magic system where microorganisms had evolved to give you superpowers while you caught a disease, because they want to keep you alive while you use the magic, right?
Can I nitpick it?
Yeah. So I wanted you to be able to catch the common cold, and you can fly while you have it, and then you get over it, and it works. But I started to build this story, and I really wanted to have people who had chronic long-term powers because of these, based on viruses. But then I was extrapolating, because the difference between a bacteria and a virus is very distinct. And before I'd done my research on it, immune theory and things like that, I hadn't realized how distinct these two groupings were. And I had built my story to have a super weapon that someone discovered, which was penicillin, right? Which was the first antibiotics in this world. But it ended up not working at all, because the people I had built that had viral powers, it doesn't do anything to, right? And the bacterial powers couldn't give the long-term benefits, the powers that I wanted them to have, and the whole story just fell apart. So I haven't figured out how to make that story work quite yet. I probably just have to ditch the whole penicillin idea, but it was so cool to be like, penicillin is like it was the weapon of mass destruction on this world, because, you start giving people this, and they start losing their magic powers, and suddenly your kingdom is way better off than theirs, because none of them have powers. But I'm still trying to figure out how to make it work.
I can help you with that later.
Maybe I can add something. I don't know. Maybe some of you know my short stories series of the Akazvanit. It's called Akazvanit the Liar, and it's mainly about medicine. And I have this Richards here. She's my Richards. So for one of the stories, I just wanted to do something, and I went to Karen and I said, okay, what if I do this and this? She's going to say, is that something called something? It's going to, no, you can't do this. Okay, maybe something else. No, you can't do this. It will never work. And it's like, let's go on and on till she gave me this idea. Oh, just do this will work. And just the whole story was building around this. The original idea didn't work. So it happens a lot.
For me, it's a time travel paradox. Right? I wrote a time travel book, and then I read a book on physics about time travel. You cannot stay at the same timeline and change the world. So I have to do a parallel universe, and people are unhappy about it.
I think my favorite research, I'm the one who gets all the research question about medicine. I think my favorite was Vera. I haven't seen Vera Tochterman, her book Blue Blood, about vampires. I think it was midnight or something like that when she texted me, how much blood can you drain out of a person and he can still walk?
Oh man, writers get on all the watch lists. Somebody's watching our Google results, and it's like, why is this person Googling, how do you kill someone with a tack? Or how much blood can you drain and they can still do math in their head? Or
I think my worst story to write was Dahlia. It's about this woman who becomes a goddess. And I had to research the KKK, the Nazis, how fast do cars combust when they're in a huge car accident. It was terrible.
I was when she was writing this story. Sorry, go ahead.
For me, it's murder mystery. I got now a lot of commercials on Facebook about the pardon lawyers and stuff. I didn't murder anyone.
Pripyan was writing that story. She asked me for ideas of how to kill people gruesomely on the road. So every drive to work and back was, okay, how can we turn this situation into getting this guy killed gruesomely? Oh, how about this cement truck could just dump the load into the car and stuff like this.
The cement truck actually made its way into the story.
Yeah, so this was a fun ride to work.
Okay, I'm going to ask a very weird question. I want only women or people who identify as female to raise their hands now, because you stopped voting. Okay, there. Yeah.
That was a pleasure, thank you.
Where do I get the inspiration for my female characters? My mother is sitting right over there. She trained me right. The other thing that I can say is I was brought into fantasy by Barbara Hamley and Anne McCaffrey, and they trained me right as well. This is hard to do, not just for men writing women, but women writing men as well, because our natural inclination is going to be to kind of the other, right, to us. And I found early in my career, before I published, one of the things, if you're having trouble with this, one of the things I was doing is I was writing all the characters but the main protagonist, who was generally a person like me. I was writing everyone else to a role and that person to a story. And this is a very big distinction. If this character is in a story, they have agency. The main protagonist was changing the world around them and was living the story, and everyone else was a role. This person wasn't a character, they were the wise mentor. This person wasn't a character, they were the love interest. This person wasn't a character, they were the plucky sidekick. And that's very natural for us because we have been inundated with media since we were little kids. And these roles we've latched onto, different people using these archetypes, and it's so very natural for first-time authors to start putting people in these boxes. And you're much more likely to put someone different from yourself in one of these boxes than you are someone who's like yourself, because you see the person like yourself and you say, oh, they have agency, they changed the world, where all these other people are just players in their story. And so the way to get over this is to start training yourself to realize that every character in your story should view themselves as the protagonist of their story. That doesn't mean they view themselves as the hero necessarily, but they're the protagonist. They are the person who is active in the story that has happened to them, and every one of us is a bit actor in someone else's story. And being able to kind of wrap your head around this, write people who are very different from yourself, practice doing that, getting advice from people who are more like the person you're trying to write. These are all methods and paths toward getting better at doing this, and it is a continuum, it is not an event. So that's just a little advice. Hopefully that'll help you. Printing. What is the place of printing in fantasy? Have you ever read The Truth? Oh, if you guys haven't read The Truth by Terry Pratchett, it is amazing, and he talks about this idea of metal, of lead becoming, it's so cool, and ink as blood and stuff like that. So read The Truth. Absolutely. I want to hear what the panel thinks about that. Printing press as a revolution.
If magic can be taught and it's not inherent and it's not something that has to do with your DNA, what if you start printing the necromancers and other stuff like this in hundreds and thousands of copies and everybody starts doing magic?
Woo-woo! It's called science when you print things and then people learn how to do things their own. Last question, curly stripes. Yeah.
So I was going to ask about what's your process in picking the distinct voices for characters? Like, for example, you could really tell in some of the chapters that someone is speaking just by the way he puts his sentences together.
I'm going to take it to the entire panel. What's your strategy to make people distinct, to make characters distinct voices in the story?
They need to have a different voice, like a different. You can have people from different nationalities. I have a scene where I have somebody who is Italian and Russian and German, and so you can have a little bit of accent. Also, you can have different behavior, like a tick or different speech pattern, things like that.
I try to drill down to their motivation and their worldview. And if I can get that expressed, it's not something we always do in real life, but in narrative, if the way the person talks can express their motivations and their worldview, I'm not talking about necessarily simple things. I'm talking about more complicated things. That a character who's more aggressive is always interjecting other people. That a character who is who has a worldview that they really think that they're right is going to go off on long explanations of this. But a character who has an experience of they're always shut up in conversations, might be timid to share their opinions and things like this. And asking myself these sorts of things about the character and trying to build dialogue that shows this is really helpful for for expressing character through your narrative scenes and your dialogue scenes in particular. And I love it. I love it when authors do it. So I'm always looking for that. I'm looking for ways that I can tie the character's personality and worldview to the way they speak.
For me, I think it's not as easy as it looks. I mean, it's quite difficult because actually, at the bottom line, everything we write comes from within us. So we tend to let everybody speak like us because this is the way we think. So for me, the way to distinguish between different characters and is just, just try to think like those characters, like a role-playing game. Just and then when you think like the other character, it affects the language, because if for example it's a character that read a lot of books in her life, she'll usually use higher language than someone that never read a book in his life, maybe never learned to read. So and if he comes from a special neighborhood, he will talk a little differently than from someone from another neighborhood. So it's those little different details and different words they choose and different sentences that will make this distinction between those characters.
Ehud, as an editor, how would you?
What I usually see with writers that get it right, that do distinct voices well, is that they know their characters. As a writer, you should always know much more about the world in the story than there is in the story. And that includes your characters. And that includes knowing what their motivations are, what their background is, what their history is, what their relationship history is, not necessarily with partners, but with the world and with the people around them. Because something like being timid to speak in a conversation might go back to, I don't know, sitting in class and not being able to speak out, or being shut down when you were young in class. That's the most general terms that I can use to try and explain how good writers create distinct voices. They know their characters.
I'm going to give the answer that nobody gave, which is you need to practice. That is, you need to start writing really, really bad, and then you get a little bit better, and then you listen to writing excuses, and then you say, shit, I did everything wrong. And then you continue to practice. And having a wonderful editor helps. So, send him your stories and make his life miserable. I will...
Better readers, really.
Yeah, better readers. I would like to finish by asking you to give a huge round of applause for everyone. You can find everybody's books outside. Ehud is the editor of Ayoya, which you can find in Duhan Aguda. Myself, Yael, and Brandon Sanderson books you can find in Yoav's Sfarim. Ron is publishing in Amazon, so you can find his books on and printed media. I want to thank you. You were awesome panelists. You dealt really well with me. Ron, you are really interrupting me right now. I want to thank you. You can't let me thank you. Brendan has lots more, so all of the questions that you wanted to ask, you'll get another shot in your Q&A with him. You can come to all the other things. We've got a writer's panel tomorrow morning and all kinds of stuff. And wonderful icons. That is